Hi, everyone. Welcome to one of Highnote's first events, Breaking the Bias. I'm really excited to have all of you here and also our panelists. We're going to go ahead and get started and walk through our agenda for today. One of the things I want to make sure all of you know is we do have some features, and this is really meant to be a discussion with all of us. So your engagement is important, and we're really happy to have you here. So let's talk about an agenda real quick. Give me one second. So we'll first do some introductions. I'm really excited. The three women we have here on our discussion, they've got some really awesome backgrounds, and so I'll take you through some introductions with them. And then, like I said, we're going to have a discussion. We've got a number of topics to talk about today. Some of those range from gender diversity to the workplace, mentorship versus advocacy, fear, which is another topic. But really, this discussion is meant to be led by all of you. And so you should see the Q&A box in your participant window. And we're really inviting you to add questions, add things that you want to make sure that we talk about. We don't have a set agenda of slides that we have to get through. And so we really want to dig in areas that are relevant to you. And then last, of course, we want to make sure to get your participation and know a little bit more about you. So we've got polls and we've got a chat where we want to start to engage you. So just make sure you orient yourself around that, and we'll push those out as we get through to push the conversation. All right, the last thing I want to mention is while you're on this, we really want to make sure that we can get a following around keeping the conversation going, because we don't want to miss out on the nuggets that we're all hearing. So I want to encourage you to keep the conversation going on social media, whether that's LinkedIn, Twitter, and use our hashtag, which is intentional inclusion, which is one of Highnote's values. So we'll be monitoring that as well, and we hope that you are able to really get a great experience out of this. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start with our panelists. I'm actually just going to go in alphabetical order, so we'll start with Kimberly, and then we'll move on to Martina and Tilly. So Kimberly, you want to go ahead and give an introduction about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Bryan. I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit organization called Black Girls Code. Our goal is really to change the face of technology by introducing girls from underrepresented communities to the field of technology and computer science. I'm a technologist by trade, so I'm a trained electrical engineer who spent almost 30 plus years in industry as an engineering manager in various verticals. So everything from consumer products to chemicals industry, finally to the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. And I really found that this particular conversation resonated so deeply with me because in many of those roles, I was one of the, probably the only or one of the few handful of women in roles of leadership. And it was really challenging to kind of marked my career through this very male-dominated industry. And so my work is really, and the work I plan to do in the future, I really want to focus on making sure that women, especially women in leadership, have the support, guidance, and advocacy even that they need so they can be successful. And so really it's about having this conversation in a way that allows us to come together and create an easier pathway, if possible, for the next generation. So happy to be in this discussion today.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Martina, you want to take us on?
Yeah, so I'm Martina Lauchenko, and I'm a partner at Costanoa Ventures. We're an early stage venture firm. We're actually one of the backers of Highnote, full disclosure, and we invest in areas of the modern data stack, fintech, and developer tools. I started my career at Microsoft as a product manager, first for Microsoft Word, then Microsoft Office, then the internet happened. So I went to Netscape, did client and server-side stuff there. So I spent my first decade or so in bouncing back and forth between product and marketing. And then the next decade, much more focused on teaching, advising. I've been teaching at Cal at the engineering graduate school for over a decade in product management and marketing. So that's my wheelhouse. And obviously in working with so many different types of people in different stages of their careers, I have seen it all, and especially at the teaching engineer level, seen when I first started teaching, I had 10% women in my class. It gets up to 30% in some good years, but this is obviously something that's very near and dear to my heart. So really excited to have the conversation with all of you today.
Thanks so much. And Tilly, can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Of course. So my name is Tilly Bennett, and I'm with SVB Capital, the equity arm of the bank, Silicon Valley Bank. We manage about $7 billion of assets across multiple products. The product that I'm involved with is the equity product, where we invest directly in companies. And so also a proud investor in Highnote. Prior to SVB Capital, I was with Greylock Partners in Israel and Europe, also focusing on fintech and enterprise software. And in between, I founded my own company, a company in the cyber insurance space that is today backed by Lightspeed, Coastal Ventures, and many other phenomenal investors, and enjoying, fortunately or unfortunately, the tailwinds of COVID, where cyber attacks have been on the rise. And the company has been able to protect enterprises across the U.S. With insurance policies. That's my background in a nutshell.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to start us off with a poll question, but I also want to invite everybody, Q&A. Now you've met our panelists. You know a little bit about their background. We've got a wide experience here too. So I'm really interested to see and some of the things that you guys are thinking about. So I'll go ahead and push a poll out to you. Let's talk about gender breakdown. So part of one of the topics that we want to make sure to talk through is around gender disparity in tech. And so we really want to better understand what's the gender breakdown of your company right now? Not assuming that you're in tech, but are you seeing more men, more women, or is it about equal? So go ahead and push those results. And we'll look for those. I'm just going to advance the slide so we have something to start. So as those results are coming through, it looks like we got a few of you submitting results. Let's go ahead and talk through this. I'm going to start with you, Kimberly, especially because I think that, you've probably seen some of this being an engineering manager and through engineering. So I'd love to hear more about kind of what you've seen and experienced in your career around the gender diversity in tech.
Yes, yeah. I think, one of the things that's been interesting to see is sort of the transition or transformation over the last 10 years in the tech industry. So I would say back in 2012, 2011, when we first started to really have these really, I want to say, tangible conversations about diversity in tech, there was, very limited representation of women, especially women in roles of leadership in most of the major tech companies. I want to say it was in 2012, but it could have been in 2013 when those diversity numbers started to be revealed publicly. I think it was Google who revealed their numbers first. There was a very low percentage of women in roles of leadership in tech, or even in technical roles in most tech-enabled companies. So I want to say it was around maybe 1 to 2%. And for women from marginalized groups, it was even less. And I have been happy, I would say, to see those numbers have increased. So there's averaging around 6 or 7%, I would say, of women in technical roles and women in some of the leadership roles. But the problem is still that when we look at this issue from an intersectional lens, so women such as myself who come from traditionally marginalized communities, that number is actually has decreased over the last 5 years. Unfortunately, there are less of us in the tech industry, and certainly very few of us in roles of leadership. And so I think this chart here in particular resonates with me more so on this bottom section of it when we're looking at the leadership roles, because I think that is where we still have so much work to do. When we have, there's over 50% of the world in terms of population is women, and we only see 19% of us in senior VP roles and even less of us at the top as CEOs. that does not set a good precedence for the next generation. And so I think more work needs to be done still to ensure that not only do we get women in the door, but that we get them in all levels up through the highest levels within industry. And even I want to say, it's great to be on this panel with Tilly and Martina, because I really think the next hurdle to cross is that one of ownership and leadership, and really giving the capital to these women who are CEOs now or who aspire to be entrepreneurs to lead and start their own companies. Because I think once we are those making the changes and creating our companies, we can really drive some really significant change.
Kimberly, I'd love to build, if that's okay, Jody's, build on something you were talking about. McKinsey and Lean In do an annual survey, Women in the Workplace survey. What's been interesting, and we do this event called Seat at the Table, where we promote a lot of that data, because like you're saying, the awareness around the problem has increased. But when you actually look at the data about why the top of the pyramid has not increased more dramatically, it's because the biggest percentage of fall off actually happens at the very first rung of management. And I think that was always this eye-opening part, which is we can't increase the top part, like CEOs and founders, if we're not really concentrating intentionally on making sure that very first rung of management actually has the biggest lift, because that's where the greatest amount of fall off happens. And then it's just a smaller and smaller pool, which leads to where we are now. So that's one fact that I think is important for everybody to know. And then the second, which is really around the theme of intentional inclusion. So I'm in venture, which obviously is extremely male dominated. And my firm was that way when I got there. But we as a firm made this very intentional and purposeful journey toward a more inclusive environment. We're now a 60-40 firm, 60% women, 40% men. And because we have that foundation in place, it's really easy to bring other women. We've got all stripes and colors. And it's because we very intentionally built this person by person as we built out our team. So that degree of intention really matters a lot, even at a very small stage company.
I would agree with that as well. And I would say from the investor hat, I think what we've seen is having diversity around the table then helps seed the investments into women founders, into diverse teams. And so when you kind of create that flywheel, it then generates that, that investment process where you bring women, you make them feel more comfortable actually presenting to a partnership that is diverse. And then when you invest in them, they continue, they hire women and or diverse teams who are then nurtured into these management roles, gain the confidence, spin out, build their own companies. So there is that chain that needs to happen. And by bringing diversity to partnerships, you're able to break that kind of male dominance that has been so long a part of this sector.
I love that. There was a question from the audience, which is also a question I had. I was really surprised by so many women falling out of the first rung of management. And so the question is really around, why does that happen? And then what forces are at play? One of the things I've actually seen personally is I have a lot of colleagues who are women product managers. And I know that even in my own network of women product managers, as I began at Highnote and thinking about intentional inclusion, there was a lot of advice that I needed to get because I was the only product manager here. And there were not as many women when I started as well. And so I'm interested in hearing my perspective was that a lot of it was around networking and finding others that I could relate to. And that actually helped more for me to be able to take opportunities of leadership. But I'm interested in the why. Why do people fall out of management? And are there other factors and forces at play than just that, what I've personally experienced around, having a network of people like myself? that I can talk to and understand what what I'm going through.
Well, it's interesting that you guys chose to name this session Break the Bias, because it turns out that winds up being one of the biggest culprits. Obviously, there are more male managers, but irrespective of that, people are unconscious about how much systematic bias continues to be perpetuated at those entry levels. So you're in a meeting and more men speak with more confidence than the women. And so that is rewarded, and it's perceived that they're better performers because they're more vocal about it. And people aren't intentional in saying, yeah, the person's a little quiet, but I actually think there's much more there. And so they just base it on what happens naturally in a room. A more intentional way of doing that is saying, I have someone who's really quiet but really smart, and she's female, and she's getting talked over by this very verbal male, and seeking that person's point of view privately so that that person doesn't need to change who they are, but can still contribute in a way that is comfortable for them. That takes a great amount of intention and thoughtfulness and awareness, and most organizations don't have that level of management or that level of awareness or coaching. So it's that sort of thing that accidentally continually rewards those that are confident, those that speak out, and that's what happens at that very first rung. And then you're always just chasing the catch up. So that's a big part of what happens.
I would like to build on that. I think that's really spot on from Martina's perspective on how you get left behind. But I think it's for women, it tends to be a bit of a double-edged sword. So even if women show up in that first leadership role as very vocal, very self-confident, all of these things that are key attributes that would make our male peers like very successful, or like, oh yeah, he's a great leader. That sometimes works against women. So those positive attributes for men, you put them in a woman, and sometimes that bias shows up, and those traits now become negative. And so it's like we often talk about it as women in industry, or just women in careers, this, the double-edged sword and the 1,000 cuts that we get, trying to break through the ceiling. I think I listened to a panel last week, and they said that like breaking this glass ceiling, or maybe we talked about in our prep call, is like we need to move the ceiling, because trying to break through it leaves us damaged and bruised and bloody because we got to break through this glass. And I think that glass, is often these biases that we get however we show up in the workplace, that it allows, unfortunately, so many of us to fall out of the funnel before we even get started.
I just want to massively plus one what Kimberly has said. And I personally had this show up for me, where it's marked as confident to a male, and it's marked as aggressive coming out of me. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, we're saying the same things, same level of quality, but it's just labeled differently. And that's the bias part that Kimberly's talking about. And I can't imagine all of us haven't felt a victim of it in some way, where I'm like, all I did was just say something that needed to be said. And it was just perceived through a lens that was not at all its intention, but that's what their bias sits within organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because there's this whole concept, which I'm sure many people have heard of, called microaggressions, which basically says that much of what happens in the organization around discrimination is not necessarily overtly discriminatory, but it could be subtle offenses that can cause people to basically be taken aback. And those would be those small things of, the everyday slights and indignities where you are either talked over when you try to speak, or you are perceived as aggressive if you are talking too loudly. And what I found was really interesting, Anne Wojcicki, who is the CEO of YouTube, in 2014 said, I've always had my abilities and commitment to my job questioned. I've been left out of key industry events, social gatherings. I've had meetings with external leaders where they primarily address the more junior male colleagues. I've had my comments frequently interrupted, and my ideas ignored until they were rephrased by men. No matter how often this all happened, it still hurt. And I think that part of that dropping out of that first rung that Martina was talking about is this constant and almost everyday, having to deal with these small slights. And what do? Do you just swallow it, or do you step up at the risk of creating friction with your colleagues? And so I think that figuring out a way to, as we say, break the bias confidently is going to be increasingly important for women as they move up the ladder in an organization, move from that first management stage to beyond, to becoming senior executives. So I think it's all very interesting. There are definitely tools and ways that women can break and address microaggression. One easy way is just to step up and say, hey, can you clarify what you meant by that statement? Or saying, I noticed you said X. I used to think that way, but my perception has changed over time. And so really giving women tools to step up for themselves and to be more assertive, I think can help women deal with these everyday biases.
Do you all think it's assertiveness that's needed to grow in leadership positions when you have these adverse environments, or are there other things that you can think of that either you've experienced yourself and tried yourself, or that you've seen other women be successful in to grow into leadership positions and get past that first rung?
I feel like it's a combination.
I want to. Go ahead, Martina. I
feel like both. You have to be both assertive, and I do believe the only way it actually happens is to have advocates as well. Like, you can be extremely capable, but if you don't have someone that's willing to say, you know what, Kimberly, you're awesome, and I'm going to advocate on your behalf, and when we're all in a room battling it out, I'm going to insist that Kimberly be the one that carries the ball forward, because I think everyone needs to see you the way I see you. And at least in my career, it has always been men that have done that advocating for me, simply because there haven't been enough women ahead of me in the organizations and the functions I've been in to be able to be my advocate. So it's required a male leader to see something in me and believe in me, beyond my also trying to be assertive or confident. And I always say this to everyone, just take your seat at the table. Don't sit in the back. Don't wait for until you have permission. Lean in and speak up. But that's hard for some people. So, but I do believe you need a combination of both.
Yeah, that's spot on. I was going to say, I'm glad that you went ahead and said that, Martina, because I was going to say the same thing, because I don't want us to always internalize, the issue. And I think we do that a lot as women in industry in our careers, that like the problem is within us, but it's really not. Like, these are systemic issues, and others need to take some of the burden. And I absolutely think that it's this notion of a supportive community and advocacy and sponsorship that helps us break through. And I remember, this situation really early in my career. I had just gotten, one of my first director roles in a large pharmaceutical company, and all of my peers were men that were significantly older than me. There's 5 of us, the group of directors over the facility, and me, only woman. Only person of color on the team at that level. And I remember vividly, I would go into our team meetings and I would be quiet. Now, I'm a pretty self-confident person, but I was like quiet. I wouldn't say anything. And I had my boss's boss pull me to the side and say, hey, what are you doing? And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I'm trying to fit in. Like, I want all my male peers, I want them to accept me. I don't want to come off too strong. He was like, no. I hired you for a reason. Like, there's a reason that you're here, to break up this monotony on this team, and for your ideas and for what you bring to this team. And I need you to speak up. I need you to be present. And this was, as I said, my boss's boss. And so he was at a senior VP level. And it was throughout my time in that position that he was often the person in the room to speak my name, advocate for me when I wasn't there. It was him. It wasn't my direct boss. It was my boss's boss. I got a rating one year and it was good, but he made it higher. So he told my boss to make it higher. And I think that's the value of having an advocate, of a sponsor that, just like Martina says, that speaks for you, that pushes you, that makes sure you get a fair shot in whatever it is, be it a raise, promotion, review, whatever. Like, it's critical. And for me as well, like, I would say 99% of the time throughout my career, that has also been men. It has often been men. It's always, I don't want to say always, but mostly has been men who have been those folks that have been advocates and sponsors for me, even today, you know, and being in a senior leadership role. It's most, I would say many of my advocates are men, and that has made a big difference.
I love that you guys mentioned that, because someone had asked, you know, how can we, you know, what suggestions do we have for male colleagues? Because I don't think everyone on this call is just female. You know, what suggestions do you have? Because I'm hearing advocacy. Are there other things that they can take away from today and start maybe doing in the workplace to be able to advocate for their female colleagues?
One thing I think could be helpful is to be cognizant if there is a female colleague who happens to be more quiet, creating an atmosphere that would invite her to speak. And making it comfortable for employees to be able to assert their opinion, be creative, be bold. I think is a big way that that male colleagues can start that. And it could be as small as, there are studies that show if somebody is able to speak within the first 10 minutes of a meeting, they feel more comfortable in their role longer term. So if it's a new employee, a female employee, give her that first 10 minutes, maybe ask a question that isn't too intimidating, but that gets them to speak and breaks that barrier of feeling quiet. And maybe that's the safest place to be. I think that would be one suggestion.
I think it's a great one. And I would say, going back to our message about advocacy, everyone that's on this call that is male probably knows a handful of really remarkable women that could use an advocate. And at least in my career, I don't know why I got lucky enough, for like your SVP, Kimberly, like he chose you and he's like, you have the potential, I believe in you, and I'm going to make sure that that gets seen, even if your own boss doesn't see it as much as I do. And my greatest advocate in my career was Ben Horowitz. He was not my boss. We didn't even work in the same division. And he saw potential in me, and he saw I didn't have a good manager, or the manager above him wasn't a good manager. And so he took me aside. He said, I think you have a lot of potential, and I'd like to meet with you regularly. And I didn't know where it was going to go, but it completely changed the trajectory of my career and what I did. And obviously he's incredible. And he saved my neck a couple of times because he was always looking out for me. So everybody probably has someone that they've seen somewhere, not necessarily in your own organization or your own function, that you think deserves to be elevated. Find that person and let them know, I think you've got a lot of potential and I want to see you succeed, and I'm going to do my part to help you do that. And it doesn't have to be in your direct chain of command. I think that's an important thing for most people to realize.
And that could be women advocating for women, by the way. We're not necessarily all leaning on stronger men to lift us up, but I think women should be helping other women, advocating, making safe spaces, making it psychologically safe for women in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think, it has been both for me. I think it may be, to Martina's point, has been more men for me because I've been in more male dominated industries. And I think that oftentimes some of my mentors who have been other women are also facing their own battles. And so it becomes difficult then, to also, lift as we climb. But I think that's part of what should continue to happen as well, is for us making space for other women leaders, and not get caught in this notion of competing with one another, because I think that also is just a false narrative and a systemic issue that unfortunately happens sometimes as well.
I think one other just general thing is to make sure we give ourselves permission to have these conversations, and sometimes challenging conversations. This has happened to me where our male colleagues say, well, I don't want to be perceived as artificially advocating or inflating for someone, so how do I handle this gingerly? And just making it safe for them to ask questions and not feel like they're going to accidentally step on something or accidentally be perceived as having prejudice or bias, but welcoming and being a safe person to have conversations like, how do I handle the situation deftly? And giving them the hand that, well, again, everybody wants to have this conversation, but sometimes it feels trickier for some than others. But all of us just having this panel conversation, I think is an example of women lifting as they rise as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting a ton of questions about advocacy. And so I know our first poll was a little short, so I'm going to push out another poll to the audience. And this is around who has been your greatest advocate. So has it been women? Has it been men? Do you not have an advocate? Because I really want to really dive into this idea of advocacy. I also think, Kimberly, you had mentioned, the difference between advocacy, mentorship, sponsorship, and all those definitions. So I do want to start and making sure we define those terms before we start to really dig in and think about what are we talking about when we talk about advocacy, mentorship, and sponsorship. So Kimberly, do you want to talk about your definition of those things, and then we can dive into some of the questions and things that people are wondering around that?
Yeah, sure. I wish I had the textbook definition for it, but the way I define it is mentorship is having someone who can even be a peer who helps you share your successes and your wins and gives you coaching and some feedback and encouragement along the way. I think of a sponsor, though, is a bit different. It actually is someone who has some degree of power and authority to make decisions and to, as I said before, to speak your name in those rooms that you're not in. So this is a person that has a certain level of power, by positional power, positional authority, etc., that can make things happen for you. Not saying that mentors can't, but I'm saying that sponsors must be able to make something happen that allows some of your path to change, another role, another opportunity, whatever. And I think that advocates, are a little bit of both. Those are folks that don't necessarily need to be able to make an opportunity open up for you, but they can certainly share in your successes and wins and provide support. But these are folks that are just like your cheerleaders, your advocates, those folks that say your name in a way that allows you to, be elevated in whatever you're doing in your path and your work, and they speak well of you and what you're doing, and they help you get to the next rung of on the ladder. So I think an advocate doesn't necessarily have to be directly engaged in your work on a day-to-day basis, but someone that's going to be an advocate for you just in your leadership journey or your professional journey. And I have lots of advocates that, I don't work with on a day-to-day basis, but I know that I can go to these individuals and say, hey, can you help me open a door here? Can you give me some advice on XYZ? And those folks show up for me day after day.
It looks like I'm just looking at our poll results, most of the people on this call have had advocates, mostly of women, but there are 20% that don't have an advocate. What would you say to those 20%? Maybe Tilly, do you want to start off? I know that SVB is doing a lot to advocate for entrepreneurs, so I'd love to have the audience hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, SVB is, I'd say this is in its lifeblood to advocate for entrepreneurs. And specifically, SVB is doing a ton to bring underrepresented populations to the forefront of entrepreneurship, of board composition, leadership composition. I think that I'll talk structurally about some of the programs that are going on, but I'd say more informally, I think it's important for individuals within an organization to generate, in terms of advocacy, generate peer groups that can be helpful. Sometimes it takes a little bit of giving before you get that. So maybe if you don't have an advocate, maybe you can start by advocating for someone else and being that person that people can turn to, and then you'll just find that karma comes back. So I'd say that may be a mechanism to do that. And then more broadly and structurally as it relates to SVB, because it's part of the reason that I'm at SVB. I'm so proud of the organization, but they have really created a very broad framework to help women and underrepresented minorities, as I mentioned. One of the things that SVB is doing for founders is working with other organizations like All Raise, which is a group of women VCs, and or Startup Grind, which is focused on women and founders of color. We do a ton in terms of learning labs, firesides, office hours, and we also work with accelerators. We are also supporting two organizations. One is called Valence, which is helping Black professionals and women get jobs and be hired into the tech industry. And so I think if there are individuals who would like to be more just part of growing their network, growing their group, then definitely they can reach out to SVB, and we'll be happy to help on that front. We can be the advocate for those individuals.
That's really cool, and I'm glad that you noted some specific places to reach out, because I know that I'm the person that takes the notes behind the scenes. One question that did come up, which I think is one that is very topical, and Kimberly said this question is specific to you. In your experience, how is it different in terms of advocacy for women and color? Because Tilly mentioned a lot of the work that SVB is doing around entrepreneurs, not just women, but also around people of color. Do you feel like there's a different experience there that is something that we're maybe not talking about?
No, I don't know that it's a different experience per se. I think that there are different challenges to getting those advocacy groups for women of color. I think one of the things, as I recall from corporate America, is that there were many different employee engagement groups for different communities. So like a Black employee network, a women's network, an LGBTQ network, and all of those certainly have intersections, but I think the challenges of each of those individual communities could be differential, right? And so I think as we see what I'm seeing, and I'm not in corporate America right now, but what I am seeing lately is a bit of divergence from not having so many individual communities and combining them into one. And I don't necessarily know that I believe that's the right way to go. I think that there is a value in having these communities that have some shared challenges, shared experiences, because in that way, we can relate on a very deep level on how we can become successful and how we can overcome these things. And I think that pulling these groups together is where there is a lot of power in building these advocacy, and then building those bridges across to the other communities as well, because that collective work and responsibility to make change in the industry, I think, is a very powerful concept.
One of the challenges we have at Highnote is we don't have many employees yet. And so, Martina, I know you've worked with us quite a bit, and you work with a lot of companies at our size or just starting. How do they do this? How do they build we're also building a lot of things behind the scenes, but are there little ways that you can build those communities, or that you can start somewhere, potentially if you're in a smaller company?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most powerful ways to intentionally be inclusive is through how you hire and having mandates. There was a question in the Q&A about like, hey, should we be measuring something? A great place to start is to try and have 50-50 candidate slates for every position that you bring in. And just mandating that by itself is extremely powerful for so many reasons. It shows the employees that you're willing to put your intentions, your actions behind the intentions. And then just as important, though, is who is doing the interviewing on the other side. You want to make sure there's diversity in the interviewing slate so that when diverse candidates come in, they say, oh, I can see someone like me. We had an intern with us who was a woman who majored in CS, and she interviewed for jobs after she graduated. And of all of the places she interviewed, she only had one female interviewer. It was at an investment bank, and she went there only because she's like, well, I guess I could see someone like myself there. And it wasn't because it was necessarily a great match. She came out of it about a year and a half later, but it was purely for that purpose. So I think it's just a very important thing to keep in mind, both in who you bring in, just interviewing for a position, and then also what their experience is throughout that process. And then that will lead to who is there. And then I think just paying attention to what feels natural. You kind of don't want to force it. I think there's a really good balance between it feeling authentic and it feeling forced. And I've absolutely seen it be like, well, here are our values, and we're going to force it by doing X, Y, and Z. And it's not what's lived at the top. So I'd say my number one piece of advice there is whatever you want the place to feel like, make sure the very top of the organization is living it that way and practicing what they preach. And that by itself will create some of those environments and a safe space for whatever groups want to collect.
I just want to add on that. What I've seen some small startups do is they'll hire interns, and they'll take more risk when it comes to interns, because these are shorter term positions. But in many of these cases, taking more of a risk on these interns can pay off big time. You get a chance to get to know an individual for a short period of time. They get an opportunity to learn from an incredibly smart group of people. And when it works out post-college or the summer, you can bring that person on full time. And that may be a way to be a little bit more experimental and a little bit more just kind of breaking the very rigid structure that sometimes exists with hiring that I've seen work pretty well.
Yeah, I would echo that. I know my daughter, she interned at a startup company all through college that she just met. She probably met them at an event with me, and they took a liking to her, and she became an intern. And it was not the company that she decided to go with as a full-time employer once she graduates. But that experience, made such a difference in her being able to even articulate what it would be like to work in a tech firm. And so I think it also gave them an opportunity to bring in this diverse talent, as they were building the product. And I think so it was a win-win for both of them in that way. So I think, and this answers the question of like, what can companies do, but also how can they give back? It's like creating these opportunities. And even if it doesn't lead to a full-time employment situation, and you still, seed a little bit into diversifying the industry by nurturing this young talent.
And I'd actually even extend that out to sometimes take a risk on an employee, especially if you're better have tried and failed than not to have tried at all. Sometimes we always believe, well, we have to get the hire exactly right. Sometimes it's okay to take a chance and say, I think this might work out, but if it doesn't, that's okay, and give ourselves permission to have taken some risk on the hiring front for unconventional candidates, people that don't have the typical degree that you might be looking for or come from an unconventional background. And I think giving ourselves permission to not always play it safe there is an important part of diversifying the field from which we're doing our hiring. And I'll compliment Highnote is doing a really nice job of all of these things: diverse candidates, diverse slates, diverse interviewees. And I think it's shown up in who's in your workforce, even for a small company.
I think another thing that we've done at Highnote as well is we have a lot of needs. We know the roles that we have open, but being open to creating a role for someone based off of their interest and what experience they have, and having that openness in the hiring process. And so while it's very important for us to not have a bias in our interview process, we also want to make sure that we're saving room for people that could be able to provide us something that looks a little not traditional to the role opening that we have. And I know that's been important for us, and we found a lot of great candidates, and even just connected with people along the way that we can reach back to later when it feels like the right fit. One of the questions I think that we have is around accountability. So I want to get into a touchy subject around should companies share their hiring numbers? How much data should you share about diversity? I know that it was great that Google shared their data, but Google is huge, and have, they have lots of different recruiters and things that they can push towards. Like, how much should we ask that hiring numbers are shared, or even that our leadership teams should share those hiring numbers with the employees? And is that an important topic to bring up as an item for some of our attendees on the panel, or on the audience?
I can certainly say, there's being public about your numbers and there's being transparent, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. I will say that the LPs are now holding VCs responsible and accountable for what their diversity looks like. You can't just say, oh yeah, we have diverse practices. They ask, how many female founders do you have? What is the percentage male-female breakdown in your firm? And that has done a lot to change whether or not VCs feel accountable for diversifying who they reach out to and making sure they're giving consideration to a broad enough set of potential founders and also candidates. So that level of accountability, even if it's not necessarily public, actually does make change happen. And so even if it's just internally, that you are public about it inside, the executive team discusses it, or you're public about it with your board, not necessarily public to the general public, but being transparent and open about it and saying like, hey, this is where we are, we want to improve. Even Costanoa, again, years ago, when we started on this journey, we were public with our numbers. We said, we're 25% female and we know we can be better. And that's why we're being public with our numbers. Now we're public, that it's much better. But we were willing to put ourselves out there when it wasn't great, because we knew it would hold our feet to the fire to getting better.
What is an LP?
An LP is a limited partner. So VCs get their money from other people, like banks and institutions. And so they're the ones that give us their money. So they are holding us accountable. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Jody, just to build on what Martina has said, at SVB, the bank, we've also made our numbers public, but also made the goals tangible, quantifiable, and known to all of the stakeholders, so employees, board members. And I think even if this is, as Martina was saying, even if you're not where you'd like to be, you can still be aspirational in expressing where you're going and how you're going to get there. And I think that would give comfort if an organization isn't yet where they'd like to be. So I personally believe, in radical transparency, better to be transparent and open than have a cloak of just not employees not knowing what's happening and where the company's going. And I think better to communicate and better to here again, if there is an aspirational number, just communicate where you're going with that and how you'll get there.
Yeah, I think, I +1 on everything that Tilly and Martina said. I think that it is important to measure and track because that's the only way you can get to improvement or hold yourself accountable, hold your teams accountable for improving those statistics. And so I think what we did see, once those numbers first became public, was not only just an education about what these issues were in the industry, but a real push, a pressure, a little bit of pressure on these companies to improve and to do some tangible work in increasing diversity and inclusion within their companies. Now, a lot of progress has been made to some extent, but there still shows, because we can see those numbers, that there's still more work to be done.
How can you tell if someone's really doing the work? And, I know that this is, we're all seeing all of the things on LinkedIn and Twitter about, here's all of our stats, we support women. How do you know that a company's actually doing the work and not just kind of dialing it in for Women's History Month? We all laugh because I know that we've read some of those, and I know I've had a personal experience of like, that doesn't feel genuine to me based off of lived experience of other coworkers that I've interacted with. So I refrained from commenting on LinkedIn and saying what I wanted to say, but so I didn't hold them accountable. But I am wondering, like, how can you tell?
I think a lot of employers are now at least running internal Net Promoter Score surveys and engagement surveys to figure out, are employees happy with where they work? How comfortable do they feel? Would they recommend this organization to a colleague or friend? And inclusion and diversity is a big part of employee satisfaction. And it's going to come out if your employees are unhappy or if they don't feel comfortable in the organization, that will show through with the numbers. So I think measuring, and Kimberly mentioned this earlier, constantly measuring how the organization is doing, how your employees are feeling is going to be crucial in determining whether you're successful or not at achieving your goals.
I have a couple of super tactical things. One is just to check out Glassdoor. It's a way for you to get a sometimes anonymous lens of how collectively employees feel about a place. And to Tilly's point, if it's not a place where there's psychological safety for everyone, that's going to show up in the numbers. The second is just to look at history. So PR stunts versus a long-term systematic commitment to inclusion just shows up when you look at how has somebody been contributing or being a part of this conversation over longer periods of time. One of the blessings of social media is you can see the trail. And you can see like, oh, did they take a one-time lap during Women's History Month? Or time after time do I see evidence of this? And the greatest is if you actually can talk to someone that if you're looking to join a company like this, is to talk to someone who works there and say, how does it feel to you? And is it real? And they will tell you.
I also think it's interesting to look at like where good leaders go. So I know so many of the younger women in technology that have crossed my path over the last 10 years and maybe started out at some of those places that, are most familiar to many of us, but they don't rise through the ranks to the top of those industries. And that tells me that there's a problem there, because I know these women are brilliant and genius and just excellent at what they do. And when I see them not being able to rise and be recognized for their brilliance at some of these larger companies, and I don't want to call any names, but that tells me there's a problem. So even when there are companies that really profess to be great at diversity and inclusion, and I see strong female talent, strong talent from marginalized communities, not being able to rise through those ranks there and really get credit for their achievements, that is what tells me that I'm not seeing the full picture.
I like the way you described it as not seeing the full picture.
Right.
I think that makes a ton of sense. I think we had a lot of people who actually submitted to the poll. I want to push the results to the audience because we actually had some questions around men, and it looks like men have been advocates to, now that we've got some more people, to some of the individuals here. Have you ever had an action that you've seen that's super well-intentioned, but actually was not helpful by a man that advocated for you?
This is one where the intentions behind it were valid, but it was accidentally very harmful. And just from my own experience, I started off my job at 75% because I wanted to preserve it with very clear boundaries, time for my family. And so my pay reflected that. And I was doing my full-time job in that 75% part of the time. And after 6 months of this, I was starting to feel resentful, saying, I know my work product is the same as my male colleague, but I chose to put myself at 75%, but it's really just 75% pay for the same amount of work. The time shouldn't be the same. And when I approached my bosses about that, they're like, well, the opportunity cost for this person, they were talking about it, I'd say, from a lens that reflected some of that. Well, he's the primary breadwinner and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, whoa. Shouldn't it just be about our product and what we're producing for our jobs? And isn't that really the sole measure of it? And it began a conversation that was uncomfortable, and it resulted in us eventually getting the same pay. But I'd say that was an example where unintentional pay gaps arise because of decisions that many times women make for family reasons or whatever, and it's not just gender specific. This can happen in any gender, but these are where unintentional gaps happen, and we justify them for good reasons, and we don't take the time to examine, is this really fair? Is this right? And that's an example of accidental bias and well-intentioned individuals accidentally winding up in a situation that actually wasn't serving everybody to their best and highest purpose. So I just bring that up as an example of it happens even for really well-intentioned people that are doing things for good reasons.
That's a great example.
I don't have a specific example, but I do think there is a risk when we lean on men as either sponsors or advocates that we are kind of the Cinderella in distress kind of, we need a stronger male to get us out of this situation or to help us up. So I could see the flip side. It's important to have the advocate or the sponsor, but there's that delicate balance of really, empowering a woman versus creating the damsel in distress type situation that could be more harmful than helpful ultimately.
That's a good point about managing perception and trying to manage it. Earlier we talked about managing the perception of assertiveness versus maybe something that doesn't come as easily for someone else, like speaking up. What are ways that have any of you experienced that personally? I will say I'm a naturally pushy person. And maybe that served me well in some situations and not so well in others. So I personally don't have like some of those features that others don't. But I'm wondering if all of you have had something where you have to overcome some perception around like the assertiveness or not assertive. Kimberly, you gave a good story before about that, but I think our audience wants to hear more tips about how we overcome these these problems and the perception that others have of us based off of who we are, and probably not a person that if we try to change will come, will result in like showing up genuinely.
I have a super tactical tip from my own personal life where I would sometimes ask questions in meetings that were earnest questions, but were for whatever reason viewed as challenging of the person I was asking them to. And so a habit I developed to overcome that perception was to clarify intentions in asking a question. Kimberly, I'm trying to decide for myself whether or not this is a path that we want to take. So have we considered X, Y, and Z? So why I'm asking the question is being asked along with the question, so no one can question, have their own lens for why I'm trying to do this, or presume an agenda. I'm clarifying it right at the onset. And that has been huge in dispelling some misperceptions that I'm trying to go after people or I'm challenging them, when honestly, I'm just trying to ask a question.
I don't know. I'm kind of conflicted on this one because I think it puts a lot of burden on us as women and leaders to we have to self-monitor the way we show up as leaders naturally. And that's hard sometimes, right? Especially if you want to just get things done. And I feel that this is more like a systemic issue that we need to talk about. Like, how do we make space for women to show up in leadership in different ways, because we all are not going to be the same. Like we've done many of these DISC profiles and such within our teams, and some people show up in the dominant category, some people are influencers, some people are about collaboration, some are situation. We're all over this spectrum, and we need to find a way, I think, to change the system so that it's okay. So if you are a female leader and you show up in the dominant, category, that doesn't mean that your leadership style is all bad. There's some things that is good to be a little bit on that D. There's sometimes when you need to have a little bit more of that C. So allowing space for another woman in leadership that I admire a lot, she used this term about spaciousness. So like giving women in leadership roles the spaciousness to be all of their full selves. So to use those assertive characteristics and that be okay when you need to, but also room to grow and to use some more of those collaborative characteristics and give us the space to learn how to use all of those things to do the best of our ability. And so that's why I feel like it's really a systemic thing, not like I want us to take a little bit not to be unself-aware. Like, yes, I think we should be self-aware of how we show up as leaders always, but leadership is hard. So also trying to self-monitor how you show up as a leader every single day and how you ask questions like that becomes a lot at times when we are also tasked to do the same job. Like Martina said, we're going to do the same job as our male peer, but we also have to be self-monitoring 24/7. Like, that's a lot. And so I think for me, I want to figure out how we can push past some of these biases that are put on women in leadership roles so that they can just lead and have the spaciousness to grow into the best leader they can be.
I really love that, especially a lot of my conversations with some of my colleagues that I talked about, those other, women in product that are also in leadership, I think have been challenged with, defining a value system for yourself. Like, how do you want to show up? Who are you? And I feel like it's very important to start with, like, who am I? What are my values? And then being able to show up in that way, because oftentimes those values do show them up in the way that you represent yourself. And I find that making space for those is really important. What if people aren't making space? Like, what if, what happens when you're in a role or you're in a company where you don't have that intention of making space for those individuals? Like, what do you do next? I mean, I think that what we see in a lot of these companies is that people leave, or they write Glassdoor reviews, or, is there anything else that we can do to try to hold people accountable to making space for us if we know we've defined these things about ourselves and they hired us to do that job?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think this is like the whole concept of radical candor, and the ability to have quick, candid conversations with people to both give and take feedback. And so if you're finding yourself in a situation where you're either misinterpreted or someone says something, you're like, wow, where did that come from? Instead of letting it fester, immediately go to that person and say, hey, you made this comment. I wasn't sure what the intention was. Can you clarify for me what the intention was? And then you can say what your side of, this is how I experienced it. And then you can immediately resolve it. And taking a little bit of the pressure out of those days, the death by 1,000 cuts, that's what lets us create the space when it's not created for us. And I think that's where it's on each of us. And it is a huge burden, by the way. I can really do, like, God, I have to keep so many balls in the air at all times. And I know my male colleagues do not necessarily do the same. But these are small ways in which we can create a little bit of relief that helps our workplaces become more functional, because the direct relationships that we have on a daily basis are consistently improved. And I think that makes things consistently just a little bit better.
Is there anything specific in tech that makes this conversation a little bit differently about things? I think about this is about, being able to break the bias in the tech sector and make it, women dominated and women dominating the tech sector. Like, is there something different about tech that we should be considering as part of this conversation?
I don't think that I would say there's anything that's, from my perspective, that's very specific to the tech industry that I haven't heard some of the same concerns and complaints from my peers that are in other industries, entertainment, education, higher ed. I'm not in higher ed, but I don't know what's going on over in higher ed, but I see a lot of complaints from educators that are in higher ed that are, trying to get on the tenure track, or a lot of politics in higher ed and who gets recognized for their work and such. And, that's how the whole site Black Women Twitter advocacy started. It was about, who gets cited for their research and who gets those reviews. And I think so. I'm saying that to say that I don't think this is an industry specific issue that we're dealing with. I think it is, unfortunately, endemic to all industries, and especially in those in which women are not at parity with our male peers. It may be heightened in those industries such as tech, but I don't think that's any different than what our women female peers in finance, education, entertainment, all of us, are experiencing the same thing. I mean, we can look at, just this recent issue in pop culture. I don't know if it's called pop culture, but with the film and Jane Campion and this comment that her male director peer made about her work. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is something that I might hear or see in tech, but it's the same situation in which, her work was devalued or criticized by one of her male peers because, there was a perception that she should not be the one telling that story. And especially came at a time that was very interesting when she was being recognized for this work. So I think we all see it as women, you know, in the world across many different fields.
I agree with everything Kimberly said, but I will add, I actually have more hope for tech than I do for many other industries. And it's largely because there's so many new companies that get stood up every single day. There are so many really, really, really smart, progressive people. And so I actually do have a belief that tech can lead the way here. And I would like us all, everyone here who's in tech, to embrace that opportunity that we can lead the way and show how it can be done, which means we won't be perfect, but we can be better examples of what things can look like. So I'm very optimistic, and I would love to see tech lead the way.
Tilly, I'm interested in some of the entrepreneurs that you work with. I mean, I will tell you that I had never thought of myself as someone who could be a CEO or start my own company. And I have peers who, of course, they would do that. That's, you know, they got great ideas, and they, you know, that is part of their career planning that they would have thought of. Do you see a thread through some of the entrepreneurs that you see that are women, that maybe connects it to the hope that Martina sees in tech?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I agree with both Kimberly and Martina. I think there's something, I think it's more endemic, but where there's hope is, I think that women, I can say from my personal story, when I was growing up, my father, I'm the youngest of three girls. I have two older sisters. My father would take us out on Saturdays and teach us math. And it was always like not an issue. It was because he felt he loves math himself. He would teach his little brother math, and that was just the thing that he did. And so we all grew up with math as a big part of our household and just education. And fast forward years later, my sister went on to become a mechanical engineer. She was salutatorian of her class at Columbia in the engineering department. My other sister is an economist, and I'm probably the least successful of my siblings as a venture capitalist. But I think that a lot of where there's a change is that there's now a recognition that there is a disparity, that we need to be better. We need to teach our kids. I've got 4 kids. I've got 3 boys and a girl. I'm very conscious of what I communicate to my boys and what I communicate to my girl. I feel like if we start from the very earliest ages, from our households, from our school systems, from how we think about educating our children, exposing them to STEM classes and science and math, and giving them that confidence, I do feel that the world is moving towards a better place, one that is more inclusive, one that is much more aware, one that is ready and charging forward in terms of making it a better world for our kids and for our peers. So I think what all of that comes to say is that the women that I've seen in tech have grown up in households where it was just clear that gender was not an issue. They just felt like it was a thing. Sure, I'm a woman, but that's not a big deal. I think that same drive that exists for men exists for women equally. And it's just a little bit about creating that exposure from day one and nurturing it all the way through.
What about representation? Because I know that I grew up with 2 brothers. I have an engineering degree also, but I never imagined. I think if you look back at my school records, I wanted to be a teacher. I think at one point I wanted to be a lawyer, hence the pushiness. I never dreamed of being an engineer until I realized I was good at math, and that seemed to be a good option for me. I never imagined myself, certainly to be a product manager, but to ever think about starting a company or leading a company or doing any of that, what is it about representation that's important too? Because I do feel like that one of the questions that came through was about, what happens between entering the workforce and rising through it. And we talked about advocacy and having advocates, and I've certainly had some of those. Still doesn't change the fact that sometimes I don't picture myself being anything more than, the product manager that I am. What am I missing? What is it representation? Is it other women who are telling me, of course you could be a CEO or start a company? Or is there something else I'm missing as part of my career journey that I might not be getting right now?
I mean, do you have to be a CEO or or an entrepreneur? I think Silicon Valley glorifies CEOs and entrepreneurs, but that may not necessarily be the path for everyone. It's not necessarily the path that you have to take. So I would reverse the question back and ask what is important, right? What is important for each individual? Everyone's path is very different. I do think we have to question the statistics, right? If 2% of venture capital funds are going to female founders, why is that, right? There is probably a larger pool of women who are worthy of venture capital funding and not getting that. So that comes with changes that need to happen as on the partnership level, bringing more female partners, bringing more female investment professionals, bringing more female LPs to the mix, who then create the flywheel to invest in female founders and nurture that representation. But I also think we have to ask ourselves, what cultures are we at? What values are we advocating for? What's important? And it is a very personal question for every individual.
Tilly, you bring up such an important point. I was at this event 2 weeks ago. It was the Stanford Business School with VC alumni, and every single student, and it might be who was at the Stanford Business School, but everyone as they introduced themselves would say, "Oh, I'm so-and-so. I hope to be a future entrepreneur." And everyone who didn't say that said, "Well, maybe someday I will be." And so after my 5th introduction, I just said, there are people that actually need to do the work in these companies. Not everyone needs to be a founder. But to your point, it's been so glorified that everyone feels like, oh, if I'm not founding a company or running it, then I'm not as successful as I should be. And I don't think that's true. I think you can be totally excellent at so many things, and being excellent in whatever you choose to do gives people permission to make that same path and that same choice theirs as well. So whatever it is you choose to do, in whatever shape and form, I'd say just be excellent at it, and that's great representation. On the other side of that, I will say, never in my life did I envision being a board member or know what it was or think it was interesting, because I was like, oh yeah, so it's like old guys do that later in life. And then I showed up at this collection of women in product where the way to enter it was to bring in someone that you were trying to advocate for. And so you'd had someone that was older and younger, and there was a woman board member there, and she told us what that was like. And I was like, I never in my life thought about that, but maybe that should be a path for me. And then great credit to my advocate boss. I told him, I was like, I never thought about being a board member, but I think maybe that's a path that I want to be on. And 3 months later, he put me on a board. And that's what started my journey. So it goes both ways.
I just think for me, I wouldn't disagree with anything that Tilly and Martina said. I just think, I just want to see women have options and opportunities for whatever. So if that is starting their own company, I want them to have an option and opportunity to do that. If that's, becoming a product manager, I want them to have an option to do that. You're like me. I think some of my assertiveness came also from, I always wanted to be a lawyer. I don't know how I ended up being an engineer, but my dream was to be a lawyer since I was like 7 years old. And, and I feel like women should have options and opportunity for that too. So even at my big age, I won't say my late age, I am now considering finally going back to law school, and I just something I always wanted to do. So I think for me, this work and my path has always been about not necessarily getting women into the tech industry, giving them those skills, yes, and giving them exposure, yes, but just making sure they have these toolkits, these tools in their toolkit, and then that they have options and opportunities. Like I have one daughter, and that's my primary, goal for her. It's just like, let me make sure that she has every option and opportunity to follow whatever her path may be. And I think that what I have seen is that too often women are put into a bucket of what we can and cannot do, and that's been the case for centuries and centuries. And I feel that my work is to make sure that we break down the walls of that box so that women can go and do whatever it is that makes them happy and brings them joy.
I love that. And I love being intentional about optionality, right? Of just giving exposure. It's the same idea as, letting your kids try soccer. And if you're not good at it, then we can do ballet. And then if you don't like that, we can do something else. And just having the option to try things and attempt them, I think is part of the journey that we can all go on. So I love that. We're getting close to the end of time, and what I want to make sure to be able to do is let each one of you sort of end in a summary of advice that you would give for people. I will say I think a lot of what you guys are saying is resonating with a ton of people, but knowing that we've got some men on the call, we have some women on the call, we have people who are advocated for, not advocated for, like, what's the parting gift that you'd give to people as they think about moving on past March, just to be able to break the bias and I would say be intentional about it, and be specific about that. Do you want to go in an opposite order, or does somebody? I don't want to put anyone on the spot with like I have a good answer right away. So. What order do you want?
I'm happy to start and do the opposite. Okay. I mean, I think that if I were to summarize, part of it is to get advocacy, give advocacy, find a way to give to others, find their, and another thing that you can do is find groups where you can be a part of a community, and in that sense, create more advocates across not just your organization, but across the broader industry. Another thing which I think is nice to do, and SVB offers this to all of its employees, but donate to organizations that are driving the cause. There's the Last Mile Education Fund and others, but that's a small way where you can chip in and help beyond March, as is written here. Internships. So if that's something that came up, if your team or your organization can bring on internships, that's a really nice way of bringing about change in our industry and a way to give to others and create opportunities. So those would be a few pointers on my end from this conversation.
Does that mean I'm second?
Whoever wants to jump in is totally fine.
I can go. I will say that there's two things. I think for the women, I wanted to say, don't be afraid to bet on yourself. Like, don't be afraid to bet on yourself. I think it's important for us, and we had a slide that we didn't really get to, is to like push past these fears of what we don't know, things we need to learn, to push ourselves a little bit into that space of learning how to, create our own paths and not having all the answers in the beginning. I think that holds us back much too often in terms of following our goals and dreams, is because we don't have all the answers at one time. Just take that first step and then learn step by step as you go. And then I would say for our male allies and advocates is like, make some space at the table. Like, so that might mean you get up and move your chair. That may mean you write the check for a female founder. That may mean you bring on that intern that comes from a marginalized community or from a unique background and experience. But I do believe that our male advocates and allies, and I want to say accomplices, have to make some space so that we can bring more diversity and equity even into the workplace.
I'll build a little bit on where Kimberly just left off there, which is 4 points, 4 tips to leave you with. One is to speak up if you hear or see something. This literally just happened to me today, where someone told me that a woman on a team that's managed by a woman leader was feeling that she was being singled out relative to her male peers. And so I said, well, we're going to have a talk about it, rather than just saying, ooh, that's too bad. So speak up. Again, this is gender agnostic. Speak up if you see or hear something. Number 2 is improvement's going to be a lot of little hacks. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic wand that's going to create this better world. It's all of us doing a little bit every single day to make things a little better. And so on that note, number 3 is to decide what you're going to do starting Monday. What are the little things? Is it that you're going to try and make sure there are more diverse candidates being considered? Is it to try and improve an interview process? Is it to decide I am going to advocate for someone that I think is really great and I've never been intentional about that? So deciding what you're going to do different starting on Monday. Don't wait. And then last but not least, and probably most important for everyone on this call, is decide what's important to you and then guide your career path through that lens, because success is very personal. You don't need to define your success by anyone else's standards or measures. And if it's working for you, go with it. And it's okay to make whatever choice feels good to you. So make sure you take the time to define what it means for you and to live true by that. So Kimberly, if that means going back to law school, go sister.
I feel like you guys are talking to me as well. So I really appreciate all of that. I just want to thank you all for sharing so much honesty, and also thanks to all the attendings. You guys had great questions. I can tell you this is my first time moderating and I was super nervous, but I chose to do this just to get out of my comfort zone and do something small. And I've had great panelists who have supported me, great producers behind the scenes who have also been supporting. So thank you to all of you. I'm going to do a shameless plug, but I'm also going to add in one tip that I came up with. Please stay in touch with Highnote. We're doing awesome things. For those of you that need an advocate or that or also just want an advocate, you can obviously connect with us at Highnote, but I can say for me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat with you. I love talking about product management. And so if you find as part of this that you need someone to help advocate for you, or you just need some mentorship, I'm happy to offer that to you, because I think that I always say that I've stood on some of the shoulders of other giants before, and I want to be able to pull you up with that too. So thank you all for your time. We've got in the chat, if you've got other tips that you want to share with people, feel free to add those. This is really about building a community. And so we can't wait to continue some of these going forward.
Thank you, Jody and Highnote, for having this forum. It's wonderful.
Yes, thank you for having us. It was a great conversation, and thank you for sharing this space with me, Tilly and Martina.
Thank you to all, and thank you to our audience. And it was a really special hour and a half.
Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Bye.